Back with you on the Newsfeed PM Late Edition. Trade and Industry Minister Pakstow says South Africa is hoping for a mutually beneficial agreement with the United States. He outlined the country's strategy ahead of a 30% hike on the South African goods beginning on Friday. This will include importing liquefied natural gas for a 10-year period, the simplifying of a 2016 tariff rate quota for the U.S. on poultry exports and blueberries into South African markets. That have also been suggested. The plan also includes mining and metal firms investing over $3 billion in the U.S. industries. There is also a joint investment in critical minerals, pharmaceuticals, and agri-machinery. The Trade Department says the exemption of specific sectors from reciprocal tariffs to preserve supply chains is also on the table. This will include shipbuilding and counter-seasonal agricultural trade. Dow says they are still awaiting final word from their United States counterparts. Now, political economy, Southern Africa Executive Director Sia Biniza joins us now for more on this. Sia, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. Well, I've counted a list, grocery list of what South Africa is willing to concede to the United States in order to sweeten the deal and get an agreement in place. We are now hearing happening on the Air Force One cross-border as he's flying back home. Trump saying he's not coming to the G20 summit. He's got many problems with South Africa. It means that the grocery list is not impressive to Trump at all, it seems.
Indeed, indeed. I think it's also a continuation of this sort of benign neglect towards Africa in general that the US or Trump administration in particular has been notorious for. It's quite a pity, though, that, the current foreign policy approach led by the Trump administration is a day and night comparison to what they've always been fighting for in the rules-based multilateral world order that they've been trying to defend up until now. It's the worst kind of bargaining, this sort of trade bullying with the whole world. The worst case scenario, it lasts for the next 4 years, but hopefully, saner heads will prevail at the end of the Trump second administration.
Are we sounding too desperate in our proposal?
Indeed. I think, these are also common kind of bargains that the U.S. has made with some of its biggest allies. If you look at the U.S. trade deal that Trump's just inked out now with the EU and some of the demands that they made to even the UK, it's very sinister way of, I think, having or entering these trade agreements by basically threatening your trade partners into an agreement. This is not typical of your bargaining that you would want. And also the arbitrariness of the single principle that they're trying to defend in minimizing the deficits that they have, when in fact they have the great benefit of being the world trade and reserve currency, as well as being a major exporter of financial capital into the rest of the world. And so it's quite sad, but countries are really just throwing at the Trump administration what they hope that they'd be interested in. And it's quite difficult to tell, how bad or severe the issues would be. For example, whilst these tariffs are targeted at quite a high rate at 30% against South Africa, and I think a number of other African countries, including Mauritius, Botswana, and others, ranging between 30 to 50%, some of the exemptions seem to bypass a significant portion of this. Of course, Africa as a whole exports around 30 billion to the United States, and about a third of that is just crude oil, right? The rest being made up of some critical minerals such as silver and raw materials such as cocoa powder and fertilizers. Some of these won't necessarily be affected by the tariffs. And so it seems also quite a huge amount of threatening for countries that are very small. I mean, 50% tariffs against Lesotho. It's for a very small landlocked country. That probably doesn't even constitute less than 0.1% of what the US imports from the world. However, it's being sort of unfairly penalized. So, yeah, it's desperate. It's desperateness on the part of South Africa. But I guess for our sake, a huge chunk of what we export will be affected in terms of the automotives that will be the severest affected by the tariffs. And that's quite a lump sum of money, about $2.7 billion that will be export losses. So it is desperate times, but quite tyrannical the way in which the Trump administration is going about these trade negotiations.
There are some who believe we could have maybe had a better negotiating position if we would have even responded as a bloc or even a regional response from a SADC point of view. But looking at how the EU would have responded, others, France in particular, calling this particular response giving in, saying they were calling instead for a tariff retaliation and a warning that Europe would be politically weakened if it didn't hit back. I mean, how the EU would have responded to this, and do you think the SADC region would have had any better response?
Sure. Look, again, I think it does present some benefit for small countries such as Lesotho, having a sort of blanket approach. What defense would Lesotho have against a 50% tariff against the US? What retaliation could they have? Except in the group, maybe they could find some solace in that their effective tariff could come down slightly, just given that, if it's not for just the critical minerals alone, the African exports are, because they're raw materials, quite important for the US in terms of importing for, beneficiation and manufacturing. However, if you look at what, for example, the EU agreed to, it paints also another picture that there's really very little safety even in numbers. The EU has agreed to importing over $750 billion worth of energy imports from the US. And so essentially this includes LNG, liquefied natural gas. So basically they've just turned off their pipelines from cheap, affordable gas from Russia in order to replace that with expensive imports from the US. In addition, they made commitments to invest around $600 billion in the US. And that's supposedly, intended to help the US reshore some of the sectors that they're trying to get back into the US from a manufacturing perspective. But it's not clear to me what exactly there is for European countries, especially if you look at some of the key exports will still be facing stiff tariffs. Automotives in particular, some of their manufactured products, and the quite clear benefits that the US, particularly services, digital services, will have across the European Union. And so, yeah, it's actually a dark day for Europe. Everybody is affected, but a big signing and deal day for the Trump administration. But again, I'm not sure how long these agreements will hold. I'm not sure whether obviously that's going to affect European manufacturers severely. And at the same time, the Chinese have just stepped out of their own roadshow across Europe where they made some significant agreements that position themselves as a better alternative. So I'm not sure, as people also start feeling the pain of the Trump tariffs, which have been negotiated from, under duress and threats from the Trump administration, comparing that to, the promise or benefits that the alternative markets such as BRICS and BRICS countries and China leading that will present. And obviously the US cannot tariff the whole world. And so certainly some countries will be starting to look the other way or directing their trade and relations in business towards East or Southeast Asian countries, and BRICS in particular in the global South will generally be a very attractive alternative to this, tyrannical approach to trade negotiations that the Trump administration is leading.
Speaking of BRICS, of course, he's also said there is no negotiation on an extra 10% for those who are aligning with BRICS. But then the question is, I mean, could South Africa, maybe even other countries within the SADC, have played hardball to this predatory tactic of negotiation with the minerals and say, well, we'll take the minerals to China. You need aluminium, you need metals, you need other minerals. We'll take them to China.
Yeah, look, on that front, it's really difficult to coordinate, and also I think the Chinese market presents, although it does present an alternative, is also limited in itself. But at the same time, it's very difficult to coordinate that across different countries, especially given what the US has entered in some of its most critical markets coming with to the table. For example, if you think of the huge commodities deal that the Trump administration signed with the Tshisekedi administration in the DRC, and almost overnight resulted in a quelling of some of the conflicts in Eastern DRC. Where we are now at this time of the year compared to February, when there were reports of the advancing M23 and other rebel groups taking over Bukavu and other parts of Eastern DRC, to where we are today is day and night. And this was literally on the heels of the US $2 trillion trade deal with the DRC. And so it's difficult to then compare as to firstly what the Chinese are offering as an alternative, but also the potential that the Chinese market still presents is also limited in itself. And, China itself is, I guess, the only country that has quite significant leverage against the US, and that shows up in how the trade negotiations have turned out between the US and China in comparison to what the US has made out of the deal with the Japan and the EU more recently. It's quite clear that China really is the only one with leverage against the US. But again, they're also feeling the impact of the tariffs, and they're also trying to pivot towards stimulating their own domestic consumer demand with the hopes that it will cushion that shock. I don't think that China is at a position to completely replace the US at this stage. However, it is presenting competitive alternatives and really in the space of diplomatic relations and international trade, this kind of bargaining by duress compared to diplomatic approach that the Chinese present is clearly a competitive stroke, but by no means a replacement of the US demand from a consumer point of view.
All right, let's look at this, of course, where we started. I mean, him snubbing the G20, or at least threatening to do so, still leaving a window, I suppose, open to say, I'd like to, but currently I might not come, which means maybe he's open to be convinced. I mean, one would look at it and say, he's coming to meet other world leaders who I'm sure he doesn't want to meet also because they might have a thing or two to say to him because of these tariffs. But what does it reflect about his attitude towards this multilateral platform, and what would be the implications of that?
Sure. I think firstly it's quite clear a shunning of the multilateral platform in itself, presenting to snub a place or a platform that he's supposed to be chairing or co-presidents with South Africa, right, as the incumbent. The other thing, I think, in his leaving of a little space for him to do what is commonly now referred to as a taco, Trump taking a double count or reneging on his decision, is that he might change his mind. And I guess it goes to show their approach in these trade negotiations also is about how far they can take things. I think they're by no means unaware of the potential retaliation or the potential negative impact that a drawn-out trade war against China and the rest of the world could have on their own economy. And so it is leaving room to do a 180 if things turn out terrible. But if he feels as though his leverage or his bargaining power, remains untouched, and that the tariffs being implemented against the rest of the world from the 2nd of August have led everybody to try and grovel or find a deal, it seems that he might just snub it. But already, I mean, the program of the G20 has been ongoing with a kind of half-hearted contribution from the US. And I guess in other multilateral platforms, he's shown the same kind of disdain or disconnection as what he's shown in the early departure from the NATO conference, etc., NATO summit, and other multilateral platforms. And so, yeah, it's straight out of the Trump playbook of the deal where you threaten everybody, including your allies, and hope that they're willing to negotiate for softer landing, but still end at a punitive outcome against your allies.
Biniza, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on this evening. Political Economy Southern Africa Executive Director Biniza. They're joining us, responding, of course, to the latest developments, indication from the United States. U.S. President Donald Trump is saying he is not planning to attend the G20 summit. He'd like to, but right now it doesn't think that he will.